The world ablaze, the decision takes shape. Picture, if you will, a man seated alone in the dim glow of his Oval Office. The year is 1941, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt leans back in his wheelchair, studying a map of Europe that tells a story of unprecedented conquest. Red pins mark the fallen capitals: Warsaw, Copenhagen, Oslo, Brussels, Amsterdam, Paris. Each pin represents not merely a city captured, but an entire nation's sovereignty extinguished in a matter of weeks, sometimes days. The mahogany desk before him bears the weight of intelligence reports, diplomatic cables, and strategic assessments that paint an increasingly dire picture. A half-empty glass of water sits forgotten beside papers marked "Most Secret" in bold red letters. The room is quiet, save for the occasional crackle from the fireplace and the distant sound of Washington traffic beyond the windows. Roosevelt's fingers trace the coastline of Britain on the map, that last bastion of democracy in Western Europe, standing alone against what many military analysts believe to be the most formidable war machine in human history. How had it come to this? How had Adolf Hitler's Germany transformed from a defeated, economically devastated nation into a continental empire in less than 2 years? The answer lies in a revolution in warfare that caught the world's military establishments completely off guard. While Britain and France had spent the 1930s preparing for another grinding war of attrition, another Somme, another Verdun, the German Wehrmacht had been quietly perfecting something entirely different. They called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The concept was deceptively simple in theory, devastatingly effective in practice. Concentrate overwhelming force at a single point of attack. Use Stuka dive bombers to shatter enemy communications and demoralize defenders. Send panzer tank divisions racing through the breach, bypassing strongpoints, driving deep into enemy territory to sever supply lines and command structures. Follow with motorized infantry to consolidate gains. The goal was not to engage the enemy army in pitched battle, but to paralyze it, to move so fast that traditional military responses became impossible. Poland had fallen in 27 days. The world watched in stunned disbelief as the Polish cavalry, still clinging to 19th-century concepts of warfare, charged German tanks with sabers drawn. It was both heroic and heartbreaking, a symbol of how completely the nature of warfare had changed. Denmark surrendered in 6 hours. 6 hours. Norway, with its formidable terrain and determined population, held out for 2 months. But even that resistance crumbled under the weight of German air superiority and amphibious assault tactics that no one had anticipated. Then came the campaign that shattered every assumption about modern warfare. On May 10, 1940, German forces launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the assault on France and the Low Countries. The French possessed what many considered the finest army in the world. The Maginot Line was an engineering marvel, a chain of fortifications along the German border that military experts declared impregnable. But Heinz Guderian and his Panzer Corps didn't attack the Maginot Line. Instead, they did something the French High Command had declared impossible. They drove their tanks through the Ardennes forest. French military doctrine insisted that the dense woods and rough terrain made armored operations there unfeasible. German reconnaissance and engineering units had spent months proving otherwise. In 72 hours, German spearheads had crossed the Meuse River and were racing toward the English Channel. The French command structure, designed for the methodical warfare of 1918, simply couldn't respond to the speed of German movements. Orders took hours to reach frontline units. By the time French reserves could be mobilized and moved to counter German advances, the situation had changed completely. Paris fell on June 14th. France, the great military power that had stood against Germany for 4 years in the previous war, surrendered in 6 weeks. Roosevelt understood the implications better than most. The balance of power that had governed international relations for centuries had collapsed in a matter of months. Britain now faced an enemy that controlled the resources of an entire continent: the coal and steel of the Ruhr Valley, the oil fields of Romania, the agricultural wealth of Ukraine, the industrial capacity of occupied France and Czechoslovakia. Winston Churchill's defiant speeches could not mask the mathematical reality. The Royal Air Force had won the Battle of Britain, yes, but at enormous cost. Fighter Command had lost nearly 1,000 aircraft, and 500 irreplaceable pilots. German U-boats were strangling British supply lines in the Atlantic. Merchant ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. American intelligence estimates, prepared by the War Department's most capable analysts, painted a sobering picture. If Britain fell, and many believed it was a matter of when, not if, the United States would face a hostile power controlling the Atlantic approaches. German naval bases in Ireland and Scotland would put U-boats within easy striking distance of American shipping lanes. The industrial capacity of Europe, combined with German technological innovation, could produce a surface fleet capable of challenging American naval supremacy. But it was the intelligence reports about German scientific research that truly kept Roosevelt awake at night. Fragmentary reports from German refugees, intercepted communications, and British intelligence suggested that German scientists were investigating something called atomic fission. The implications, if true, were almost too terrible to contemplate. Einstein's letter, delivered to Roosevelt in 1939, had warned of this possibility. It may become possible, the physicist had written, to set up a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium, by which vast amounts of power and large quantities of new radium-like elements would be generated. This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs. The president had authorized preliminary research, but American efforts remained scattered and underfunded. If German scientists achieved a breakthrough first, if they developed atomic weapons while controlling the resources of Europe, the consequences for human civilization were unthinkable. Then came December 7, 1941, a date, as Roosevelt would tell Congress, that would live in infamy. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor transformed American involvement from a possibility to an inevitability. But it also created a strategic dilemma that would define the next 4 years of global conflict. The American public, shocked and enraged by Pearl Harbor, demanded immediate retaliation against Japan. Politicians called for every available ship, plane, and soldier to be sent to the Pacific. The cry for vengeance was understandable, human, and strategically dangerous. Roosevelt and his advisors faced a choice that would determine the fate of Western civilization: fight a two-front war with inadequate resources, or make a strategic decision that would be difficult to explain to a grieving nation. The Germany First strategy had been debated in theoretical terms for months. Now it had to become reality. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, laid out the logic with characteristic precision. Germany represented the greater long-term threat. German industrial capacity dwarfed Japan's. German scientific research was more advanced. German U-boats were already attacking American shipping. If Germany achieved a breakthrough in atomic research, or if Britain fell and German forces gained access to British naval bases, the war might become unwinnable. Japan, for all its tactical brilliance at Pearl Harbor, remained strategically contained. The Pacific Ocean itself was America's ally. Vast distances that Japanese supply lines could not indefinitely sustain. Japan's industrial base, dependent on imported raw materials, was vulnerable to naval blockade. Germany's continental empire was self-sufficient in ways that Japan's Pacific conquests could never be. But how to defeat Germany? The Royal Navy controlled the English Channel, but barely. German coastal defenses, strengthened continuously since 1940, had transformed Western Europe into what propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels called Fortress Europe. The Atlantic Wall, stretching from Norway to Spain, represented the largest defensive construction project in human history. Any invasion of German-occupied Europe would require unprecedented coordination between American, British, and potentially Soviet forces. It would demand new technologies, new tactics, and new levels of industrial production. Most challenging of all, it would require perfect timing, a convergence of weather, tides, intelligence, and military readiness that might occur only once. As Roosevelt studied his maps in the quiet of that December evening, he could not have imagined the complexity of what lay ahead. The decision to open a second front in Europe would ultimately involve 2 million Allied personnel, 7,000 ships, and the most elaborate deception campaign in military history. It would require the cooperation of resistance movements across occupied Europe, the development of specialized landing craft and amphibious warfare techniques, and the coordination of air, sea, and land forces on a scale never before attempted. The man who would ultimately command this operation was, at that moment, still a relatively unknown colonel stationed in the Philippines. Dwight David Eisenhower's name appeared nowhere in Roosevelt's strategic planning documents. The beaches of Normandy were still 3 years away from their appointment with history. But the great wheel of strategic decision was beginning to turn. In Moscow, Stalin was demanding a second front to relieve pressure on Soviet forces. In London, Churchill was balancing his desire to maintain British influence with the recognition that American resources were essential for victory. In Berlin, Hitler was making the fateful decision to declare war on the United States, transforming a regional conflict into a truly global struggle. The stage was set for the greatest military operation in human history, an operation that would require not just courage and sacrifice, but a level of strategic planning and logistical coordination that would test the very limits of human organizational capability. The Arcadia Conference, forging the alliance. The urgent telegram from London arrived at the White House on December the 9th, 1941. Churchill's message was characteristically direct. He was coming to America. Within days of Pearl Harbor, the British Prime Minister had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. He would cross the Atlantic in wartime, through waters prowling with German U-boats, to meet face-to-face with Franklin Roosevelt. The Arcadia Conference, as it would later be known, began on December 22, 1941. Snow dusted the White House grounds as Churchill's motorcade arrived from Union Station. The Prime Minister had traveled over 3,000 miles, not for ceremony or diplomacy, but for something far more crucial: the forging of a unified strategy that would determine the fate of the free world. In the map room of the White House, two men who had corresponded for months finally sat across from each other at a mahogany table. Roosevelt, confined to his wheelchair but radiating quiet authority. Churchill, stocky and determined, his ever-present cigar creating small clouds in the winter air. Between them lay maps of 3 continents, marked with the positions of armies, fleets, and air squadrons. The challenge they faced was unprecedented in military history. Never before had 2 democratic nations attempted to coordinate a global war effort across such vast distances. The logistics alone were staggering. American industrial capacity would need to supply not only its own forces, but also British, Soviet, and eventually Free French armies. Raw materials from dozens of countries would flow through shipping lanes threatened by submarines. Millions of men would need to be trained, equipped, and transported across oceans. But first, they had to agree on where to fight. The American public, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, demanded immediate retaliation against Japan. Newspaper headlines screamed for vengeance in the Pacific. Congressional phone lines buzzed with calls for action against the empire that had launched the sneak attack. General MacArthur, trapped in the Philippines, sent increasingly desperate messages requesting reinforcements. The political pressure was immense. Yet in that White House map room, Roosevelt and Churchill were studying a different theater entirely. Their fingers traced lines across the Atlantic, pointing to the coast of Nazi-occupied France. Churchill spread out intelligence reports detailing German submarine production, aircraft manufacturing, and rocket development. The numbers painted a stark picture. Every month that Germany remained undefeated, its technological and industrial advantages grew. "The Hun is at his strongest now," Churchill observed, his voice carrying the weight of 2 years of solitary struggle. "But he is also overextended. From Norway to North Africa, from the Atlantic Wall to the gates of Moscow, his lines are stretched thin." Roosevelt nodded slowly. The president had been receiving similar assessments from his own military advisors. General Marshall, his army chief of staff, had prepared detailed analyses showing that Germany's war economy was still accelerating. Their scientists were developing jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, and other weapons that could shift the balance of power decisively. Time was not on the Allies' side. The strategic logic of Germany first was compelling, but it required a level of trust between nations that had no historical precedent. American factories would produce tanks and aircraft that would fight under British command. British intelligence networks would guide American bombing campaigns. Combined staffs would need to coordinate operations across multiple time zones, languages, and military traditions. In the Pentagon, American generals were already expressing skepticism. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, made no secret of his preference for a Pacific-first strategy. The Navy had been humiliated at Pearl Harbor. King wanted immediate action against the Japanese fleet. General MacArthur's supporters in Congress echoed these sentiments, arguing that America's primary enemy was the nation that had actually attacked American soil. But Roosevelt understood something that the public did not yet grasp. Germany possessed the industrial capacity and scientific expertise to develop weapons that could make invasion of Europe impossible. Intelligence reports spoke of German research into atomic weapons, long-range rockets, and jet-powered aircraft. If Hitler's scientists achieved breakthroughs in these areas, the window for victory might close permanently. The conference sessions stretched deep into the winter nights. Military staffs worked around the clock, calculating shipping tonnages, production schedules, and training timelines. The complexity was overwhelming. American steel would need to be transported to British shipyards to build landing craft. British commandos would train American Rangers in amphibious warfare techniques. Canadian factories would produce ammunition for weapons designed in American arsenals, but manufactured in British plants. Churchill brought with him detailed plans that had been developing in British war rooms since 1940. Operation Sledgehammer, a limited cross-channel attack in 1942. Operation Roundup, a full-scale invasion planned for 1943. These weren't abstract concepts. They were carefully calculated military operations with specific requirements for men, ships, aircraft, and supplies. The numbers were staggering. A successful invasion of Europe would require at least 1 million men in the assault phase alone. They would need 5,000 ships of various types, from battleships to landing craft. Air superiority would demand thousands of fighters and bombers, operating from bases that didn't yet exist. The logistical tail would stretch across the Atlantic, requiring a continuous stream of supplies, replacements, and equipment. Roosevelt's military advisors were divided. General Marshall supported the European strategy, but worried about the timeline. Could American industry scale up quickly enough? Could American soldiers, many of whom had never seen combat, match the battle-hardened Wehrmacht? Secretary of War Henry Stimson shared these concerns, pointing out that the American army numbered fewer than 200,000 men in December 1941, smaller than many individual German army groups. Yet the alternative was equally daunting. A Pacific-first strategy would mean allowing Germany to consolidate its conquests, complete its fortifications, and potentially develop war-winning technologies. Every intelligence report from occupied Europe painted the same picture. German scientists were making rapid progress in areas that could fundamentally alter the nature of warfare. The breakthrough came during a late-night session on December 30th. Churchill had prepared a presentation that would later be called one of the most persuasive strategic arguments in military history. Using detailed maps and production figures, he demonstrated that Germany's apparent strength was actually a weakness. The Nazi Empire was consuming resources faster than it could replace them. German armies were spread across a front stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the Sahara Desert. Most critically, German submarine warfare was failing to prevent American industrial might from reaching European battlefields. Roosevelt made the decision that would shape the remainder of the war. America would commit to a Germany-first strategy, despite public opinion and political pressure. The resources necessary for a Pacific offensive would be redirected to the European theater. American boys would learn to fight on the beaches of North Africa and the mountains of Italy, preparing for the ultimate test, the liberation of Western Europe. The formal agreement, signed on January 1, 1942, was deceptively simple. A few pages of text that committed two nations to the largest military undertaking in human history. But behind those pages lay months of detailed planning, countless hours of staff work, and the recognition that failure would mean the permanent triumph of fascism in Europe. As Churchill prepared to return to London, he understood that the easy part was over. They had agreed on strategy. Now came the infinitely more difficult task of execution. Somewhere across the English Channel, German engineers were already beginning construction of what they called the Atlantic Wall, a fortified barrier designed to make invasion impossible. The race against time had begun. And why Germany first? The rationale unveiled. But why Germany first? As Allied planners gathered in the weeks following Arcadia, this question demanded answers that went far beyond diplomatic courtesy or Churchill's persuasive charm. The decision would commit millions of lives and the industrial output of entire nations. It required cold, strategic logic. Picture the British War Cabinet Room in those early months of 1942. A long, polished table surrounded by empty chairs, scattered documents bearing the weight of empire. Sunlight streaming through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that dance like tiny worlds in the afternoon air. Here, in rooms like this, the mathematics of global warfare were being calculated with ruthless precision. The first calculation was simple and terrifying. Germany controlled the industrial heartland of Europe. From the coal mines of the Ruhr Valley to the steel mills of occupied France, from the shipyards of Norway to the oil refineries of Romania, Nazi Germany had assembled an industrial empire that dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. Every month of delay meant more tanks rolling off production lines in Czechoslovakia, more submarines launched from captured French ports, more aircraft engines manufactured in factories that had once served democratic nations. But the numbers told only part of the story. German industry wasn't just large, it was efficient. The same methodical approach that had revolutionized German manufacturing in peacetime now served the war machine with devastating effectiveness. Where American factories were still retooling from civilian production, German plants had been optimized for military output since the mid-1930s. The head start was enormous. Consider the U-boat campaign that was, even as Allied leaders debated, strangling Britain's lifelines across the Atlantic. German submarines were being constructed at a rate that shocked Allied intelligence analysts. The Type 7 U-boats, those sleek predators of the deep, emerged from German shipyards every few days. Each one represented not just immediate threat, but proof of industrial capacity that could only grow stronger with time. Admiral Ernest King, the prickly commander of the U.S. Navy, understood this arithmetic better than most. Despite his well-known preference for Pacific operations, he recognized that German naval production posed an existential threat to Allied supply lines. "We cannot fight a war," he told his staff, "if we cannot move supplies across oceans." The Battle of the Atlantic was being fought not just by ships and submarines, but by the industrial capacity to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. The strategic planners also grasped something that public opinion often missed. Germany's technological advantages were accelerating, not diminishing. In laboratories across the Reich, German scientists were pursuing advances that could fundamentally alter the balance of power. Rocket technology that would eventually produce the V1 and V2 weapons. Jet engine development that promised to revolutionize air warfare. Most ominously, theoretical work on atomic physics that, while still in its infancy, represented a potential game-changer. Every month of delay gave German researchers more time to perfect these innovations. Every season that passed allowed German engineers to strengthen the Atlantic Wall, to improve their radar systems, to develop new countermeasures against Allied tactics. Time, the most precious commodity in warfare, was working in Germany's favor. But perhaps the most compelling argument for Germany first lay in the realm of alliance politics, a consideration as crucial as any military factor. The Soviet Union, bearing the crushing weight of the German war machine on the Eastern Front, was hemorrhaging men and material at rates that defied comprehension. Soviet losses in 1941 alone exceeded the entire military strength of most nations. Stalin's increasingly desperate messages to Roosevelt and Churchill carried an unmistakable subtext. Without significant relief, the Soviet Union might seek a separate peace with Germany. The nightmare scenario kept Allied planners awake at night. If Stalin concluded that his Western allies were content to let Germany and Russia bleed each other white, while America focused on Japan, he might revive the spirit of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. A separate peace between Germany and the Soviet Union would free dozens of German divisions for redeployment to Western Europe, making any future invasion attempt virtually impossible. General George Marshall, the methodical architect of American military strategy, understood this political dimension with crystal clarity. "We are not just fighting for territory," he explained to his staff. "We are fighting to keep our alliance intact. The moment our allies believe we have abandoned them, we will face Germany alone, and that is a war we cannot win." The geographic realities reinforced this strategic logic. Germany sat at the heart of occupied Europe like a spider in its web, with transportation networks radiating outward to every conquered territory. From Berlin, German commanders could shift reserves to threatened sectors faster than Allied forces could mount sustained operations from distant bases. The central position that had served German strategy so well in previous conflicts now provided defensive advantages that would only strengthen with time. American intelligence analysts, poring over reconnaissance photographs and resistance reports, painted an increasingly sobering picture of German defensive preparations. The Atlantic Wall was not merely propaganda, it was becoming reality. Concrete bunkers sprouting along the French coast like malignant growths, artillery positions carefully sited to create interlocking fields of fire, beach obstacles designed by engineers who understood that the Allies would have only one chance at amphibious assault. General Omar Bradley, who would later command American ground forces in Normandy, studied these reports with growing urgency. "Every day we wait," he observed. "The wall grows higher and thicker. What might be possible in 1943 could become impossible in 1944, and certainly impossible in 1945. The window of opportunity was closing with mechanical precision. German defensive improvements followed predictable timelines. So many bunkers per month, so many miles of obstacles per week. Allied planners could calculate, almost to the day, when the Atlantic Wall would become impregnable. The mathematics of concrete and steel were working against them. Yet beyond all these practical considerations lay a deeper strategic truth. Germany represented the intellectual and industrial heart of the Axis alliance. German scientists advised Japanese researchers. German tactical innovations influenced Italian operations. German diplomatic pressure kept neutral nations from joining the Allied cause. Defeat Germany, and the entire Axis structure would begin to crumble. Continue to allow German strength to grow, and the task would become exponentially more difficult. As winter gave way to spring in 1942, these arguments crystallized into unshakable conviction among Allied leadership. Germany first was not just strategically sound, it was strategically essential. The industrial mathematics, the technological timeline, the alliance politics, the geographic realities, every factor pointed toward the same conclusion. But conviction alone would not breach the Atlantic Wall. Somewhere across the English Channel, German engineers continued their methodical work, turning the coastline of Europe into a fortress. The race against time had indeed begun. And the Allies were already behind. The next phase would require something unprecedented in military history. An invasion force capable of overwhelming the most heavily defended coastline in the world. The planning for what would become Operation Overlord was about to begin. The arsenal of democracy mobilizing for war. The scale of what lay ahead defied comprehension. To mount an invasion capable of breaching Hitler's Atlantic Wall would require more than strategic brilliance or tactical innovation. It would demand the complete transformation of American society itself. Every factory, every shipyard, every training ground would need to be reimagined for a single purpose: delivering overwhelming force to the beaches of Nazi-occupied Europe. In Detroit, the assembly lines that had once produced Buicks and Chevrolets began retooling for tanks and aircraft engines. The same precision that had revolutionized automobile manufacturing now turned toward instruments of war. Henry Ford, who had once been skeptical of American involvement in European conflicts, found himself overseeing the construction of B-24 Liberator bombers at the massive Willow Run plant. The facility stretched for over a mile, a cathedral of American industrial might, where a completed bomber rolled off the production line every hour. This transformation rippled across the continent. In shipyards from Maine to California, the rhythmic hammering of rivets echoed through the night shifts. The Liberty ships, those workhorses of the Atlantic crossing, emerged from American shipyards at a pace that astounded even their creators. What had once taken months to build now required mere weeks. The record stood at 4 days and 15 hours for a complete vessel, a feat that German U-boat commanders found difficult to believe. Yet speed meant nothing without scale. The mathematics of invasion were unforgiving. Each infantry division required 15,000 tons of supplies per month. Armored divisions demanded twice that amount. The planners calculated that the initial assault would need 6 divisions, with 20 more following within the first month. The numbers grew exponentially: food, ammunition, medical supplies, fuel, spare parts. Each category multiplied by thousands of men, then multiplied again by months of sustained combat. The logistical puzzle extended far beyond mere tonnage. Every rifle needed ammunition of the correct caliber. Every tank required specific spare parts and specialized fuel. Artillery pieces demanded shells manufactured to precise specifications. The complexity of coordinating these requirements across an ocean while maintaining absolute secrecy about timing and destination challenged every assumption about military logistics. In training camps across America, young men learned the fundamentals of modern warfare. Many had never traveled beyond their home counties. Now they studied the geography of European coastlines and practiced amphibious assault techniques in conditions that approximated the English Channel. The training was deliberately harsh. Officers understood that the first minutes on a hostile beach would separate the adequately prepared from the thoroughly trained. The human dimension of this mobilization revealed itself in countless personal transformations. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers, their hands learning the precise work of manufacturing artillery shells and aircraft components. They brought a meticulous attention to detail that supervisors quickly recognized as essential for maintaining quality under pressure. In some facilities, women comprised more than half the workforce. Their contribution measured not just in production quotas, but in the reliability of equipment that would soon face the ultimate test of combat. African American workers found new opportunities in defense plants, though often in segregated facilities and under unequal conditions. Despite these limitations, their skills proved indispensable. In shipyards and aircraft factories, experienced welders and machinists trained newcomers in techniques that directly influenced the war's outcome. Every properly welded seam on a Liberty ship hull, every precisely calibrated engine component represented a small but crucial contribution to the massive undertaking ahead. The Atlantic Ocean itself became a battlefield of logistics. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes, seeking to sever the supply lines before they could deliver their cargo to British ports. The convoy system emerged as the answer. Merchant vessels traveling in coordinated groups, protected by destroyer escorts and guided by increasingly sophisticated intelligence about submarine positions. These convoys painted a remarkable picture against the grey Atlantic swells. Dozens of cargo ships maintained precise formations across miles of ocean, their hulls heavy with the tools of liberation. Tank decks carried Sherman tanks bound for armored divisions. Ammunition holds contained millions of rounds of small arms fire. Medical supplies filled refrigerated compartments. Each vessel represented months of American industrial effort, compressed into a single vulnerable target crossing hostile waters. The weather added its own complications. Atlantic storms could scatter convoys across hundreds of square miles, forcing individual ships to navigate alone through submarine-infested waters. Ice formed on superstructures during winter crossings, requiring crews to chip away accumulations that could destabilize their vessels. Fog reduced visibility to mere yards, turning navigation into an exercise in calculated risk. Yet the convoys continued their methodical progress. Month after month, the accumulated weight of American production gathered in British ports and storage facilities. Mountains of supplies grew in carefully camouflaged depots. Fuel tanks multiplied across the English countryside. Ammunition dumps expanded under cover of artificial foliage designed to deceive German reconnaissance aircraft. The British Isles themselves transformed into a vast staging area. American troops arrived in increasing numbers, their presence gradually shifting the demographic balance of entire regions. Small English villages found themselves hosting tank battalions. Ancient manor houses became headquarters for artillery regiments. The cultural exchange worked both ways. American soldiers adapted to British customs while bringing their own perspectives to the shared enterprise of liberation. Training intensified as the build-up continued. Combined operations exercises tested the coordination between naval gunfire, air support, and infantry assault. These rehearsals revealed countless small problems that could become catastrophic failures under combat conditions. Radio frequencies required careful coordination to prevent interference. Landing craft needed precise timing to avoid collisions in the surf. Medical evacuation procedures demanded split-second execution under fire. The intelligence requirements alone demanded unprecedented cooperation between Allied services. Every German fortification required detailed analysis. Coastal defenses needed mapping with photographic precision. Beach gradients, tidal patterns, and underwater obstacles all influenced tactical planning. The accumulated intelligence filled warehouses, each photograph and measurement contributing to the massive calculation of how to deliver decisive force to the most heavily defended coastline in history. As 1943 progressed into 1944, the scale of preparation became impossible to conceal entirely. German intelligence detected increased activity in British ports. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights reported growing concentrations of landing craft and transport vessels. The question was no longer whether an invasion would come, but when and where the Allies would strike. The race against time had evolved into a race against German preparation. Each month of delay allowed additional fortifications along the Atlantic Wall. Each week provided more time for German reserves to position themselves for rapid response. The window of opportunity remained open, but it would not remain so indefinitely. The arsenal of democracy had awakened to its full potential. Across America and Britain, millions of individuals contributed their skills to a shared purpose that transcended national boundaries. The tools of liberation were ready. Now they awaited the strategic moment when courage and preparation would converge on the beaches of Nazi-occupied Europe. Operation Torch and the long road to victory. But before those beaches could be reached, American forces needed their first taste of combat against the Wehrmacht. The strategic planners understood this reality with crystalline clarity. Untested troops could not be expected to storm Hitler's Atlantic Wall without prior experience under fire. The solution emerged in the form of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa in November 1942. Here, American and British forces would learn to fight together, to coordinate their different doctrines and equipment, to understand the brutal realities of mechanized warfare against a determined enemy. The strategic logic was sound, yet the execution would prove far more complex than anticipated. French Morocco and Algeria presented a unique challenge. These territories were controlled by Vichy France, technically neutral but aligned with Germany. Would French colonial forces resist the Allied landings? Intelligence reports offered contradictory assessments, leaving commanders to prepare for scenarios ranging from peaceful occupation to fierce resistance. General Dwight Eisenhower, selected to command this first major Allied offensive, carried an enormous burden. The future of Anglo-American cooperation rested on his shoulders. If Torch failed, if American and British forces could not work effectively together, the entire strategy for European liberation would collapse. The logistics alone staggered the imagination. 3 separate task forces would strike simultaneously across hundreds of miles of North African coastline. The Western Task Force, sailing directly from the United States, would assault Casablanca on Morocco's Atlantic coast. The Central Task Force would target Oran in Algeria, while the Eastern Task Force aimed for Algiers itself. Coordinating these movements required unprecedented precision. Ships departing from Norfolk, Virginia, had to rendezvous with vessels from Britain, maintaining radio silence while navigating submarine-infested waters. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. Arrive too early, and the element of surprise would be lost. Arrive too late, and German reinforcements might tip the balance. On November 8, 1942, as dawn broke over the North African coast, the first waves of Allied landing craft approached their designated beaches. The sound of diesel engines mixed with the gentle lapping of Mediterranean waves. A deceptively peaceful moment before the storm. At Casablanca, American forces encountered the fierce resistance they had feared. French naval units opened fire with their coastal batteries, their shells sending towering columns of water skyward around the approaching transports. The battleship USS Massachusetts engaged the incomplete French battleship Jean Bart in a thunderous duel that echoed across the harbor. Young American soldiers, many experiencing combat for the first time, waded through surf turned crimson by the morning sun. The sand beneath their boots was unfamiliar, the air thick with cordite and salt spray. These men, who had trained in the forests of Georgia and the deserts of California, now faced the ultimate test of their preparation. The resistance varied dramatically along the coast. At Algiers, French forces offered only token opposition before surrendering. Local commanders, secretly sympathetic to the Allied cause, had prepared their men for this moment. White flags appeared on government buildings as American and British troops advanced through streets lined with cheering civilians. But at Oran, the fighting proved savage and prolonged. French colonial troops, bound by oath and honor to defend their positions, poured devastating fire into the Allied landing zones. American rangers, attempting to capture the harbor facilities intact, found themselves trapped in a deadly crossfire between stone buildings and concrete fortifications. The learning curve was steep and unforgiving. American officers discovered that their peacetime training, however thorough, could not fully prepare them for the chaos of amphibious assault. Radio communications broke down under the stress of combat. Carefully planned timetables dissolved in the face of unexpected resistance. Yet gradually, inexorably, Allied superiority in men and material began to tell. French ammunition supplies dwindled. Isolated strongpoints found themselves surrounded and cut off from reinforcement. By November the 10th, organized resistance had largely ceased across all three landing zones. The immediate tactical victory, however, represented only the beginning of a far more complex strategic challenge. German High Command, recognizing the threat to their southern flank, began rushing reinforcements across the Mediterranean. Elite units of the Afrika Korps, veterans of desert warfare under Erwin Rommel, prepared to contest every mile of North African territory. American forces now faced their first encounter with the Wehrmacht's legendary fighting machine. These were not colonial troops bound by conflicting loyalties, but hardened professionals who had conquered most of Europe. Their equipment was battle-tested, their tactics refined through years of successful campaigns. The education proved painful and expensive. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German armor smashed through American defensive positions with devastating efficiency. Inexperienced American tank crews found their Sherman tanks outgunned by German panzers. Infantry units, caught in the open by Stuka dive bombers, learned the terrifying reality of combined arms warfare. The retreat was chaotic and demoralizing. Equipment was abandoned, positions evacuated in haste, carefully laid plans reduced to desperate improvisation. For a moment, the entire North African campaign seemed to hang in the balance. But American forces possessed advantages that would ultimately prove decisive. Their industrial base could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Their logistics network, stretching back across the Atlantic, provided a steady flow of reinforcements and supplies. Most importantly, their capacity for learning and adaptation exceeded that of their more experienced opponents. New commanders emerged from the crucible of combat. George Patton, brought in to restore American morale and fighting effectiveness, implemented training programs that transformed demoralized units into aggressive, confident formations. His methods were harsh, his standards uncompromising, but the results spoke for themselves. By spring 1943, American forces had found their fighting edge. The lessons of Kasserine had been absorbed and applied. Coordination with British units improved dramatically as officers learned to work within the complex framework of Allied command structure. The final phase of the North African campaign unfolded with methodical precision. German and Italian forces, caught between advancing Allied armies from the west and British forces pressing from the east, found their position increasingly untenable. Supply lines across the Mediterranean came under constant air attack. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft and immobilized armor. On May 13, 1943, the last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. Nearly 250,000 prisoners entered Allied custody, representing an entire army group removed from German strategic reserves. The Mediterranean became an Allied lake, opening new possibilities for offensive operations against what Churchill famously termed the soft underbelly of Europe. But perhaps more importantly, American forces had gained something invaluable: combat experience against first-rate opposition. The citizen soldiers who had struggled at Kasserine now possessed the hard-won knowledge that would serve them well on the beaches of Sicily, Italy, and ultimately Normandy itself. The arsenal of democracy had proven it could not only produce the tools of war, but wield them effectively against the most professional military machine in the world. The long apprenticeship was complete. American forces were ready for the greater challenges that lay ahead. In the quiet moments after victory, as Allied soldiers watched the sun set over the North African desert, they could not yet imagine the magnitude of the operations being planned in London and Washington, but they had taken the first crucial step on the long road that would lead, eventually, to the liberation of Europe itself. The Pacific Front, a constant struggle. Yet even as Allied commanders celebrated these hard-won victories in North Africa, another theater demanded constant attention and sacrifice. In the vast expanses of the Pacific, American forces were engaged in a different kind of war entirely. One fought across thousands of miles of ocean, on jungle-covered islands whose names would become synonymous with heroism and loss. The Germany First strategy, so carefully reasoned in the conference rooms of Washington and London, carried a profound human cost that extended far beyond the Mediterranean campaigns. Every ship, every plane, every experienced division sent to support the European effort meant fewer resources available for the Pacific theater. American commanders like Douglas MacArthur and Chester Nimitz found themselves fighting a two-front war with decidedly unequal support. On Guadalcanal, in the steaming jungles of the Solomon Islands, Marines had been locked in brutal combat since August 1942. These men understood the strategic necessity of defeating Germany first, but understanding policy decisions and living with their consequences were entirely different matters. They watched supply convoys sail past their positions, bound for North Africa and Britain, carrying equipment and reinforcements they desperately needed. The island-hopping campaigns required their own unique form of courage. Unlike the sweeping tank battles across North African deserts, Pacific warfare meant close-quarters fighting in dense jungle terrain where visibility extended mere yards. Japanese defenders, following their own code of honor, fought with a tenacity that transformed every captured airfield and beachhead into a costly victory. Admiral Nimitz, coordinating Pacific operations from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, worked within severe constraints. His staff calculated shipping tonnages and aircraft allocations with the same precision as their European counterparts, but always with the knowledge that their theater held secondary priority. Every strategic decision became an exercise in making limited resources achieve maximum impact. The psychological burden on Pacific forces was particularly acute. While newspapers celebrated Allied advances in North Africa, American soldiers fighting on remote Pacific atolls sometimes felt forgotten by the home front. Letters from families often focused on the European war, the theater that captured headlines and public attention. Yet these Pacific campaigns were developing their own strategic innovations. Amphibious warfare techniques pioneered in the Solomon Islands would prove invaluable for future operations. Naval aviation tactics, refined through countless carrier battles, were creating new doctrines that would influence military thinking for decades. The coordination between Marine ground forces and Navy support vessels was reaching unprecedented levels of effectiveness. General MacArthur, commanding Southwest Pacific forces, maintained his own vision of victory through the Philippines. His staff worked tirelessly to demonstrate that Pacific operations could contribute meaningfully to overall Allied strategy. The Japanese forces tied down in defensive positions represented enemy divisions unavailable for deployment elsewhere. The human stories emerging from these Pacific battles carried their own profound weight. Young Americans from farming communities and industrial cities found themselves fighting in tropical environments that seemed alien to everything they had known. The camaraderie forged in these circumstances created bonds that would endure long after the war's end. As 1943 progressed, the strategic balance was gradually shifting. Industrial production back home was finally reaching levels that could support major operations in both theaters simultaneously. The apprenticeship period was ending, not just in Europe, but across the entire global conflict. In quiet moments between battles, as Pacific veterans watched tropical sunsets paint the ocean in brilliant colors, they carried their own hopes for the operations being planned thousands of miles away. They understood their sacrifices were contributing to something larger than any single campaign, a coordinated effort that would ultimately bring victory on all fronts. The human cost, sacrifice, and resilience. The cold waters of the North Atlantic held their own stories of sacrifice, stories written in the wakes of countless vessels carrying hope across an ocean that had become both highway and graveyard. Here, beneath heavy grey skies, the human cost of the Germany First strategy played out in ways that statistics could never capture. Margaret Chen stood at her station in the Boeing plant in Seattle, her hands moving with practiced precision as she installed wiring harnesses in B-17 fuselages. Each bomber that rolled off the production line represented 16 hours of her life, 16 hours away from her two young children, who had learned to fall asleep without their mother's goodnight kiss. Her husband was somewhere in the Pacific with the Navy, his letters arriving weeks late, carrying news that was already outdated by the time she read it. Margaret wasn't alone in her sacrifice. Across America, families had reorganized themselves around absence. Children learned to be self-reliant earlier than they should have. Grandparents took on parenting roles they thought they'd finished decades ago. Women discovered strength in roles society had never prepared them for, and found themselves wondering what would happen when the war ended and the world expected them to simply return to the way things were. In the cold North Atlantic, merchant seaman Thomas Murphy pulled his watchcoat tighter against the spray. This was his 14th crossing, his 14th time threading through waters where German U-boats turned ships into coffins with no warning. The cargo hold below contained tanks, ammunition, medical supplies, everything needed to build the force that would eventually storm the beaches of Europe. Thomas had lost friends on earlier crossings, good men who'd gone to sleep in their bunks and never woke up, claimed by torpedoes that struck in the dark hours before dawn. Yet here he was again, because someone had to carry the tools of liberation across these dangerous waters. Someone had to accept the risk that came with being part of something larger than individual survival. The human mathematics of the Germany First strategy were brutal in their simplicity. Every resource committed to Europe meant something denied elsewhere. Every ship loaded with supplies for Britain was a ship not carrying reinforcements to the Pacific. Every factory producing bombers for the air war over Germany was a factory not building fighters for the defense of Australia. But the families making these sacrifices understood something that pure strategic calculation could not capture: that defeating fascism required more than military might. It required ordinary people choosing to give more than they thought they could afford to lose. In small towns across America, gold stars appeared in windows, quiet monuments to sons and fathers who would never come home. Yet even in grief, these families found ways to contribute. They organized scrap drives, tended victory gardens, wrote letters to soldiers they'd never met. Their mourning transformed into determination. Their loss became fuel for the great effort that would culminate in the liberation of Europe. The grey waters of the North Atlantic continued their endless motion, carrying both hope and sorrow toward distant shores. Each wave that crashed against merchant vessels and naval escorts carried the weight of individual stories. Stories of sacrifice that would make D-Day possible not through grand strategy, but through the accumulated courage of ordinary people choosing to endure extraordinary hardship. In this vast human undertaking, victory would ultimately depend not on the brilliance of generals or the efficiency of logistics, but on the willingness of millions to give everything they had for a future they might never live to see. Epilogue: the dawn of a new era. And in the end, when the guns finally fell silent across Europe on that May morning in 1945, the world discovered that the Germany First strategy had achieved something far greater than military victory. It had proven that democracies, when united by common purpose, could marshal resources and coordinate efforts on a scale that totalitarian regimes, for all their efficiency and ruthlessness, simply could not match. The liberation of Europe unfolded like a great wave washing across the continent. American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces moving inland from the Norman beaches. Soviet armies pressing westward from the ruins of Berlin. Millions of displaced persons beginning their long journeys home to villages and cities they had not seen for years. In London, Churchill stood before Parliament, his voice heavy with exhaustion and relief, acknowledging that victory had come not through the brilliance of any single leader, but through the patient accumulation of Allied strength that began with those first difficult conversations in December 1941. The statistics of what had been accomplished seemed almost incomprehensible. Over 2 million American soldiers transported across the Atlantic, 16 million tons of supplies moved through British ports, thousands of landing craft constructed in American shipyards and delivered to English harbors, all coordinated through a command structure that had learned to function across national boundaries and cultural differences. General Marshall, reviewing the final reports in his Pentagon office, marveled at how the seemingly impossible logistics of 1942 had become routine operations by 1944. But the true measure of the Germany First strategy lay not in tonnages or troop movements. It lay in the villages of France where church bells rang for the first time in 4 years. In the concentration camps where Allied medics worked desperately to save survivors who had endured the unthinkable. In the displaced persons camps where families searched bulletin boards for news of relatives they feared they would never see again. The strategic decision to prioritize Europe had meant that liberation came to millions, who might otherwise have faced years more of occupation and terror. In the Pacific, where American forces had fought with such determination despite limited resources, victory followed with surprising swiftness once the full weight of American production could be redirected eastward. The innovative tactics developed during the resource-constrained years, the emphasis on mobility and coordination, the hard-learned lessons of amphibious warfare, all proved invaluable as the final campaigns unfolded across the island chains leading toward Japan itself. The factory workers who had labored through those long shifts in Detroit and Pittsburgh, the merchant seamen who had braved the Atlantic convoys, the British families who had endured the Blitz while preparing for invasion, all could finally see the tangible results of their sacrifices. In Willow Run, the massive bomber plant began its conversion back to automobile production, but the workers who had built those B-24 Liberators carried with them the knowledge that their efforts had helped restore freedom to an entire continent. Roosevelt, in his final months, often reflected on the wisdom of that Germany First decision, how it had required him to resist enormous political pressure, how it had demanded faith that the American people would support a strategy that seemed to ignore the direct attack on Pearl Harbor. His advisors found him sometimes staring at maps of Europe, tracing with his finger the advance of Allied armies through territories that had been under Nazi control when the strategy was first conceived. The intelligence networks that had developed to support the European campaign, the coordination between British and American codebreakers, the careful cultivation of resistance movements across occupied territories, all had created capabilities that extended far beyond military victory. The relationships forged between Allied nations during those desperate years of 1942 and 1943 would form the foundation for a new international order, one based on the principle that democracies must stand together against tyranny wherever it might arise. In the rubble of German cities, Allied occupation forces began the complex work of rebuilding not just infrastructure but entire societies, implementing the lessons learned about democratic governance and international cooperation. The Marshall Plan that would emerge reflected the same strategic thinking that had guided the Germany First policy. The understanding that America's security depended not on isolation, but on the prosperity and stability of its allies across the Atlantic. The human cost had been staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties, entire cities reduced to ruins, millions of civilians who had perished under occupation or in the camps. Yet from this devastation emerged a profound transformation in how democratic nations understood their responsibilities to one another. The Germany First strategy had demonstrated that when free peoples united around common principles, they possessed a strength that no dictator could ultimately overcome. In quiet moments during the victory celebrations, veterans of the planning process often returned to those early days of 1942, when the strategy had seemed almost impossibly ambitious, when the logistics appeared insurmountable, when the political costs seemed potentially devastating. They remembered the long hours in Pentagon conference rooms, the anxious cables between London and Washington, the careful balancing of competing demands and limited resources. The Germany First decision had required a kind of strategic patience that democratic societies rarely displayed, the willingness to endure criticism and setbacks while building toward a distant but decisive victory. The technological innovations born from wartime necessity, radar systems that had protected convoys, communications equipment that had coordinated massive operations, medical advances that had saved countless lives. All would find peaceful applications in the post-war world. The industrial capacity that had been mobilized for military production would drive unprecedented prosperity. The organizational skills developed for global warfare would tackle the challenges of reconstruction and development. As the last ships returned from Europe, carrying soldiers back to American ports they had left years earlier, as the victory gardens were replanted with flowers instead of vegetables, as the rationing cards were finally discarded, the American people could see that their sacrifices had achieved something remarkable. The Germany First strategy had not only won a war, it had established America as a global leader committed to the defense of democratic values wherever they might be threatened. The lessons learned would echo through the decades that followed. The understanding that threats to freedom anywhere posed dangers to freedom everywhere. The recognition that early action, though costly, was preferable to delayed response after enemies had grown stronger. The knowledge that democratic nations, despite their political differences and competing interests, possessed an inherent advantage when they chose to work together rather than in isolation. In the archives where the records of those crucial decisions were carefully preserved, in the memoirs of leaders who had wrestled with impossible choices, in the oral histories of ordinary citizens who had contributed to extraordinary achievements, the story of the Germany First strategy would serve as a reminder of what democratic societies could accomplish when they remained true to their deepest values while adapting to the harsh realities of a dangerous world. And so the great strategic gamble of 1941 had proven its wisdom, not through the elegance of its logic or the efficiency of its execution, but through the simple fact that it had worked. Europe was free, the Atlantic Alliance was strong, and America had learned that its security and prosperity were inextricably linked to the fate of democratic peoples everywhere. The Germany First strategy had been more than a military plan. It had been a declaration of principles, a commitment to the idea that freedom was worth defending, and a promise that America would never again stand aside while tyranny threatened to engulf the world. The dawn that broke over the liberated continent carried with it the hopes of millions who had endured the darkness of occupation, the dreams of soldiers who had fought far from home for principles larger than themselves, the aspirations of leaders who had dared to believe that democratic nations could overcome any challenge when they stood united in common cause. And in that golden light spreading across the fields of France and the cities of Europe, the wisdom of choosing to defeat Germany first revealed itself not as mere strategy, but as the foundation for a more peaceful and prosperous world that would endure for generations yet to come.